So, Emma, still playing journalist? Victoria said, punctuating the question with that particular laugh she reserved for moments when she wanted everyone to know something was a joke. I looked up from my water glass at my parents' dining table, the familiar weight of dismissal settling over my shoulders like a coat I'd worn too many times. My sister sat across from me, phone in hand as always, her 2 million Instagram followers a constant invisible presence at every family gathering. She was wearing something expensive and perfectly coordinated, the kind of outfit that would photograph well, because everything Victoria did was calculated for the camera. I was 28 years old, she was 25, and somehow I was always the one made to feel like I hadn't figured life out yet. I'm an investigative journalist, I said quietly, knowing even as the words left my mouth that the distinction wouldn't matter to anyone at this table. My father barely looked up from his steak. My mother smiled that tight smile that meant she wished I wouldn't make things awkward by being defensive. Victoria tilted her head in that exaggerated way she did for her videos. Right, for that little website, she said. What's it called again? I always forget. She hadn't forgotten. She never forgot anything that could be used later. Metro Independent, I said. We have 500,000 monthly readers. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand waved dismissively. That's so cute. I get that many views on a single post. She turned to our mother. Speaking of which, Mom, you saw the Dior partnership announcement, right? The one I posted this morning? And just like that, the conversation shifted, orbiting back to Victoria's world where it always seemed to belong, leaving my work, my 8 months of sleepless nights and maxed out credit cards and 47 interviews conducted in parking garages and coffee shops and whistleblowers' living rooms, dismissed as easily as someone might wave away a gnat. They didn't know about the investigation. They didn't know about the internal documents I'd obtained from TechVision, the communications that proved CEO Daniel Crawford had orchestrated a $340 million fraud scheme. They didn't know that my editor Marcus had called it the most important story our publication would run in a decade. They didn't know that the legal team had just cleared it for publication or that the New York Chronicle was partnering with us to run it. They didn't know because they'd never asked, not once in 8 months, what I was working on, or why I looked so tired, or why I'd started working a second job on weekends to fund the investigation that my small publication couldn't fully finance. I sat there listening to Victoria describe her engagement metrics while my phone buzzed silently in my pocket, probably Marcus with final edits, and I thought about how in 3 days everything would change, how the whole country would know my name, and how this table of people who were supposed to love me would still be the last to see me coming. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. Part 2. The pattern started so early, I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined a time before it existed, before Victoria became the sun our family orbited around, and I became the distant cold planet nobody thought to visit. I remembered being 7 years old, Victoria just 4, at my elementary school science fair, where I'd spent 2 weeks building a volcano that actually erupted with baking soda and vinegar, staying up late every night painting papier-mâché mountains, writing note cards about geological formations in my careful second-grade handwriting. My parents arrived 20 minutes before the fair ended, distracted and hurried, because Victoria had a dance recital across town that apparently mattered more than the blue ribbon I'd already won by the time they got there. My mother took one photo, checked her watch twice while I explained my project, and then we left, so Victoria wouldn't be late for her 3-minute performance as a flower in a garden-themed ballet. I told myself then that it was fair, that Victoria was younger and needed more attention, that my achievements could stand on their own without an audience. I carried that lie for 21 years. The financial disparity became impossible to ignore once we were both adults, and the numbers were right there in black and white, undeniable as math. When Victoria turned 22 and decided she wanted to move out of their house into her own place in the city, my parents paid her rent, $3,500 a month for a luxury one-bedroom apartment in the kind of building with a doorman and a gym and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. When I graduated from journalism school with $60,000 in student loans, they sent me $200 a month for exactly 6 months before my father sat me down and explained that they needed to reduce expenses, that I was 24 now and needed to learn financial independence. I was working 2 jobs at the time, sleeping 5 hours a night, living in a basement studio apartment with a window that looked directly onto a brick wall. Victoria's engagement party last year cost $15,000, a figure my mother mentioned proudly multiple times while showing me photos afterward, because I hadn't been included in any of the planning despite being her only sister. They'd rented a restaurant, hired a photographer, brought in a cake that looked like a wedding cake, invited 80 people to celebrate Victoria and her fiancé Derek, who worked in pharmaceutical sales and had proposed with a ring that cost more than I'd made in 6 months. 3 months before that party, I'd won a regional journalism award for a series I'd written about public school funding inequities, a project that took me 4 months of evening interviews and weekend research. The award dinner was on a Thursday night at a hotel downtown, and I'd bought a dress I couldn't afford because I wanted to look like I belonged in that room full of established journalists and editors. I'd texted my parents the details 3 weeks in advance, then 2 weeks, then 1 week. The day of the dinner, my mother called to say they couldn't make it, that Victoria needed help with something for her Instagram, some kind of sponsored content that required a family setting, and could I possibly come over that weekend to be in some photos? I said no, the first time I could remember denying Victoria anything she'd asked for. I went to the dinner alone, sat at a table with people from other publications, accepted my award with shaking hands, and smiled for a photo that Victoria later found and posted on her Instagram story with the caption, "My sister's cute hobby," and a heart emoji that somehow made it worse. Part 3. The wedding planning became a weapon Victoria wielded with particular precision, each request a small cut that bled more than it should have because of all the cuts that came before it. She called me on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of transcribing an interview with a former TechVision accountant who'd spent 40 minutes explaining how Daniel Crawford had moved money between shell companies, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that meant she wanted something. "Emma, I had the most amazing idea," she said, not bothering with hello, never bothering with the basic courtesies that acknowledged I might have my own life happening when she called. "You should photograph my wedding. It would be such great experience for you, and you know how expensive photographers are." I'd been awake for 19 hours at that point, running on coffee and the kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing you're close to something that matters. That I'd spent the last 8 months of my life and $12,000 of money I didn't have, chasing a story that could either make my career or prove my family right about my delusions of significance. "Victoria, I'm not a photographer," I said, watching my transcription software struggle with technical financial terminology. "I'm a journalist. Those are completely different things." She laughed that dismissive laugh I'd heard my entire life, the one that said my objections were silly and unsophisticated. "It's just pointing a camera and clicking, Emma. How hard can it be? Besides, we're family. Family helps family." That phrase, "family helps family," had been used to extract free labor from me for years, Victoria's requests treated as obligations, while my requests for basic recognition were treated as burdensome asks. I'd edited her college papers, managed her social media during a vacation, designed her engagement announcement graphics, all for free while she built a brand worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I scraped together rent each month. "Professional wedding photographers charge around $8,000, I said, pulling up a tab I'd already researched because I'd known this conversation was coming eventually. "I could maybe do it for half that, 4,000 if you really wanted me to." The silence on the other end was theatrical, wounded. "You would charge your own sister? For her wedding? Emma, that's really hurtful. Mom said you'd been acting weird lately, kind of selfish, but I defended you." Of course, she'd already talked to our mother, already built the narrative where I was the unreasonable one before even asking me. When I called my mother later that day, exhausted and needing someone to see how unfair this was, she'd sighed in that particular way that meant I was being difficult. Emma, honey, family helps family. Victoria helped you move last year. Victoria had shown up 90 minutes late to my move, taken a few Instagram photos of herself pretending to carry boxes, and left after 20 minutes claiming she had a brand meeting. That was the kind of help that counted in my family's arithmetic, the performance of assistance rather than actual assistance. I went back to my investigation, to the spreadsheets that proved Crawford had stolen $340 million from investors and employees, to the sources who trusted me to tell their stories, to Marcus who actually believed in my work. And I tried not to think about the TikTok Victoria posted that night with the caption, POV, your sister is too poor to help with your wedding, that got 500,000 likes from strangers who didn't know she'd asked me to work for free, or that I'd been living on ramen and overdrawn bank account fees to fund the investigation that would change everything. The Thursday dinner at my parents' house smelled like the pot roast my mother made when she wanted everything to seem normal and wholesome, the kind of meal that was supposed to represent family togetherness, but really just gave us something to focus on besides the fact that we barely knew each other anymore. Victoria arrived 30 minutes late with her ring light and phone mount, immediately setting up at the table to film content, and my parents didn't say anything about her tardiness or the fact that she was treating their dining room like a studio, because they never said anything when Victoria turned family moments into monetizable content. We were halfway through the meal when Victoria set down her fork with that particular flourish that meant she had an announcement, her face brightening with the same expression she used in sponsored posts when she was about to reveal some product she'd been paid to promote. I'm writing a post that's going to be huge, she said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through her notes app. It's about sibling success differences, really raw and vulnerable, and my manager thinks it could be my biggest viral moment yet. My father nodded approvingly. My mother asked if she could help workshop it. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach because I already knew, that I was about to become content. Victoria started reading from her phone, her voice taking on that performative authenticity that influencers used when they wanted to seem relatable, and every word was a knife. She'd written a detailed comparison of our lives, a point-by-point breakdown of how she was successful and I was not, complete with specific details that could only be meant to humiliate. My salary, $42,000 a year, which she knew because I'd mentioned it once when explaining why I couldn't afford to travel with the family last Christmas. My apartment, a 400-square-foot studio in a building where the elevator broke twice a month. My car, a 12-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door. My relationship status. Single after my boyfriend left 6 months ago because he said I worked too much and cared too little about having a normal life. My career, which she described as pretend journalist, and blogging about local issues nobody cares about, and playing reporter instead of getting a real job. My parents laughed at certain lines, the ones Victoria had written to be funny rather than just cruel, and my mother said, "It's relatable content, honey. People respond to honesty," when I asked Victoria, please not to post it. Victoria looked at me with something like pity mixed with irritation, the way you'd look at a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. "Don't be so sensitive, Emma," she said, already typing something on her phone, probably editing the post based on my parents' feedback. "It's just content. This is my job. Besides, maybe it'll motivate you to improve your life." I left before dessert, claiming a headache that wasn't really a lie because my skull felt like it was splitting from the pressure of not screaming. And I sat in my car in their driveway with tears running down my face and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My phone lit up with an email notification, the preview showing the sender as New York Chronicle Legal Department, and I opened it with trembling fingers to read the message I'd been waiting 8 months to receive. The legal team had cleared my story for publication, every source confirmed, every document verified, Every claim bulletproof against libel suits. Publication date was set for 3 days from now, Friday morning at 5 a.m. Eastern Time, with the headline, Tech Vision CEO Orchestrated $340 fraud. Internal documents reveal. And my byline, my name, attached to the most important piece of journalism I'd ever produced. I woke up Friday morning to the particular kind of silence that comes before everything changes, reaching for my phone before I was fully conscious, because I'd trained myself over the past 8 months to check for messages from sources at all hours. And the first thing I saw was Victoria's face smiling at me from Instagram. Her post from last night already at 2.3 million likes, with comments pouring in so fast the number updated every time I refreshed. Why I'm successful and my sister isn't a thread, read the caption. And below it, she'd laid out my entire life, like evidence in a trial where I'd already been convicted, each detail carefully chosen for maximum humiliation and engagement. My salary of $42,000, presented with a crying laughing emoji. My breakup described as, can't keep a man because she's married to her career. My apartment, which she'd photographed without my permission during her last visit, and posted with the caption, "This is what happens when you don't prioritize financial success." My journalism work, dismissed as delusions of being the next Woodward and Bernstein, when really she's just blogging about local politics nobody cares about. The comments were worse than the post itself, thousands of strangers weighing in on my failures, offering unsolicited advice about how I should get a real job, or go back to school, or accept that some people just aren't meant to be successful. And I felt something crack inside my chest that I'd been holding together with spite and stubbornness, and the desperate hope that my work mattered, even if nobody in my family could see it. My phone started buzzing with texts from people I hadn't talked to in years, former college classmates and distant cousins and old coworkers, all of them sending me screenshots of Victoria's post with messages that ranged from, "Are you okay?" to, "I can't believe she posted this," to, "This is so relatable. My sister is successful too, and I struggle with comparison." That last one not quite understanding that I wasn't asking for sympathy about legitimate career differences, but rather about being publicly humiliated by someone who was supposed to love me. I called Victoria with shaking hands, my voice cracking when she answered with that bright, cheerful tone that meant she was in a good mood, probably from all the engagement her post was getting. "Take it down," I said, not bothering with hello or pretending this was anything other than what it was. "Please, Victoria, take it down. This is humiliating." She laughed, actually laughed, and I could hear her typing in the background, probably responding to comments or checking her analytics. "Emma, don't be dramatic. It's already at 2 million likes, and I've gotten 3 brand deal inquiries this morning. This is my best performing content ever. Do you know what this kind of engagement is worth?" I told her I didn't care what it was worth, that she'd exposed private details of my life to millions of strangers, that people I worked with and sources I needed to trust me professionally could see this, and she sighed like I was being unreasonable. "It's just content, Emma. This is my job. Besides, maybe if it bothers you so much, you should focus on improving your life instead of asking me to hide the truth." My parents called 20 minutes later, my mother's voice tight with that particular kind of irritation that meant I was causing problems. "Victoria is very upset," she said, not asking how I was or whether I was okay with my life being turned into viral content. "She says you're making drama about her post. Emma, honey, she's just sharing her experience. You can't expect her to pretend your life is different than it is." I hung up on my mother for the first time in my life. And then, I sat on my unmade bed in my tiny apartment with my phone exploding with notifications and strangers debating my worth in comment sections across the internet. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my humiliation was complete and public, and there was no coming back from this in any normal way. Marcus called at 9:15, his voice carrying that electric energy that meant something big was happening. Emma, he said, how fast can you get to the office? I want to move your publication date up. Tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. The Crawford story. Let's blow this thing wide open now. The office was empty except for Marcus and the night cleaning crew when I arrived at 10:30. My eyes still burning from crying and my hands steady with the kind of clarity that comes after humiliation, strips away every pretense and leaves you with nothing but the work you've done and the truth you've discovered. Marcus had my files spread across the conference room table, 8 months of investigation laid out in careful categories, source documents and financial records and interview transcripts and the internal TechVision emails that had taken me 4 months to verify and authenticate through 3 separate channels because I'd known from the beginning that this story had to be absolutely bulletproof or it would destroy my career instead of making it. Walk me through it one more time, Marcus said, and I did, explaining how I'd first heard rumors about TechVision CEO Daniel Crawford at a tech industry mixer I'd attended for a completely different story. How a former employee had mentioned irregularities in the company's financial reporting, how I'd spent the next 8 months interviewing 47 sources, including 12 current employees who risked their careers to talk to me, 6 former executives who'd left under suspicious circumstances, 3 forensic accountants who'd analyzed the documents I'd obtained, and 2 FBI sources who confirmed that federal investigators had been watching Crawford but didn't have enough evidence for charges until I'd brought them my findings. The fraud scheme was elegant and massive. $340 million siphoned from investor funds through a series of shell companies and false revenue reports. And Crawford had been so confident in his methods that he'd left digital trails everywhere once you knew where to look. I'd spent $12,000 of my own money on this investigation, maxing out 2 credit cards to pay for document authentication and forensic analysis, and travel to interview sources in 4 different states. And I'd worked overnight shifts at a 24-hour diner 3 nights a week for 5 months to cover my rent, because my journalism salary of $42,000, the same salary Victoria had mocked in her viral post, wasn't enough to fund the kind of investigation that might actually matter. The New York Chronicle confirmed partnership? I asked, and Marcus nodded, explaining that they'd published the story under their banner with my byline listed as senior investigative correspondent, that their legal team had spent 6 hours reviewing every detail and declared it the most thoroughly documented case of corporate fraud they'd seen in a decade, that the story would go live at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning and would likely trigger an FBI raid, a stock market collapse, and congressional hearings. This is Pulitzer-level work, Emma, Marcus said, and I felt something crack open in my chest that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite vindication, but was maybe just the simple recognition that the work I'd been doing in obscurity while my family dismissed it as a hobby had always mattered, had always been real, regardless of whether anyone I was related to could see it. I pulled up Victoria's post on my phone one more time, reading through her catalog of my failures, my small apartment and old car and modest salary, and delusions of journalism. And I felt something harden into resolve, because tomorrow morning the whole world would see exactly what my delusions had accomplished. I left the office at 11:30 and walked home through streets that felt different somehow, charged with the knowledge that tomorrow morning everything would change in ways my family couldn't possibly anticipate, and when I let myself into my tiny studio apartment with its ancient radiator and bathroom door that didn't quite close all the way, the space felt both smaller and more precious than it ever had before, because this was what I'd been able to afford while doing work that mattered, work that would send a corrupt CEO to prison and return $340 million to defrauded investors. And I realized I wasn't ashamed of this apartment anymore, even though Victoria had photographed it without permission and posted it as evidence of my failure. I sat on my bed with my laptop and went through my files one more time, checking and rechecking source notes and document authenticity reports, because some part of me still couldn't quite believe this was real, that my 8 months of obsessive investigation had actually produced something this significant. And I found myself remembering my journalism school graduation 5 years ago. How I'd sat in the audience in my rented gown watching other students' families cheer and take photos, while my parents were across town at Victoria's photo shoot for a local boutique campaign. How my mother had texted, "Sorry, honey, this ran long, so proud of you," with a string of emojis that somehow made it worse. I remembered my first byline 3 years ago, a solid piece on municipal corruption that had taken me 2 months to report. How I'd sent the link to the family group chat with nervous pride, and Victoria had responded, "Cute, anyone can write online though. The hard part is building an audience like mine." And my parents had liked her message, but not commented on my article. I pulled up Victoria's viral post on my phone, the one that was still climbing toward 3 million likes, and read through it one more time. Her casual cruelty about my $42,000 salary and my small apartment and my delusions of being a real journalist. And I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction, but was maybe just clarity about who my family actually was and what they valued. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria that read, "Need you to pick up my dress alterations tomorrow and drop them at the venue. The place closes at 6, so don't be late." And I stared at it for a long moment. This assumption that I would continue to function as her unpaid assistant, even after she'd publicly humiliated me to millions of strangers. And I didn't respond because tomorrow morning, when my story went live and her phone started exploding with people tagging her in articles about her failure sister's massive investigative journalism coup, she would understand that some things had changed permanently. I set my alarm for 4:30 in the morning and laid out clothes for the CNN interview already scheduled for 7 a.m. And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened the document folder containing every email from sources who'd trusted me with their stories, every interview transcript from people who'd risked their careers to expose the truth, every piece of evidence that proved Daniel Crawford had stolen $340 million and thought he'd gotten away with it. And I read through their words one more time because this was never about proving my family wrong. It was about these people who'd believed truth mattered and had trusted me to tell it. My alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, and I was already awake, lying in bed with my laptop open watching the minutes count down until 5 a.m., when the New York Chronicle would publish my investigation on their homepage. And at exactly 5 o'clock I refreshed the page, and there it was, my byline in the kind of font size they reserved for major stories. TechVision CEO orchestrated 340 Maoist fraud. Internal documents reveal, by Emma Richardson. Senior investigative correspondent. And I sat there staring at my name on one of the most prestigious news sites in the country, feeling something vast and surreal wash over me, because 8 months ago I'd been a nobody journalist at a tiny publication that most people had never heard of, and now my work was leading the national news cycle. My phone started buzzing almost immediately, text messages and emails and calls flooding in so fast I couldn't process them. Interview requests from CNN and NPR and The Today Show, congratulations from former colleagues and journalism school classmates I hadn't heard from in years. And then Marcus called at 5:14, his voice electric with an energy I'd never heard from him before, saying, "Emma, every major outlet wants you. The stock market is already reacting in pre-market trading." TechVision stock dropped 34% in the first 10 minutes. The FBI just released a statement saying they're opening a formal investigation based on your reporting, and Crawford's lawyer put out the most panicked statement I've ever read, basically admitting they're screwed. I pulled up the stock market on my laptop and watched TechVision's stock price plummet in real time, $300 million in market value evaporating in minutes. And then I found Crawford's lawyer's statement, which was a masterpiece of legal panic, all carefully worded denials that somehow made him sound more guilty. And I realized that my 8 months of obsessive investigation had just destroyed a billionaire's empire before breakfast. The article was being shared exponentially. 50,000 shares in the first hour, according to the New York Chronicle's metrics dashboard they'd given me access to. And I watched the number climb in real time while major news outlets started picking up the story. CBS News running a breaking news alert, Bloomberg covering the stock collapse, the Wall Street Journal quoting extensively from my reporting, and a congressional committee announced at 6:30 that they'd be holding emergency hearings on the fraud and wanted me to testify. I got in the shower at 6:15 because I had a CNN interview at 7 a.m., and I needed to look like someone who belonged on national television, even though I felt like an imposter who'd somehow stumbled into someone else's much more impressive life. And the whole time I was getting ready, I kept thinking about Victoria and my parents, who were almost certainly still asleep in their beds, with no idea that everything had changed. That the daughter and sister they'd dismissed as a failure had just broken the biggest business story of the year. And I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, because I'd never done this for revenge, but was maybe just the quiet recognition that I'd been right all along about what mattered, and they'd been catastrophically wrong. I finished the CNN interview at 7:45, and it had gone better than I'd imagined. The anchor treating me like a serious journalist whose work mattered rather than some nobody from a small publication. And when I got back to my apartment to change clothes before the NPR interview at 9, there were 217 new text messages and 63 missed calls. And I stood in my kitchen scrolling through them in a kind of daze, because they were from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former classmates and distant cousins, and that editor who'd rejected my pitch 18 months ago, now asking if I'd be interested in contributing to their publication. At 7:58, my phone rang with Victoria's number, and I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. And her voice came through frantic and confused, saying, "Emma, why are people tagging me in articles about you? What's happening? Your name is everywhere, and people keep commenting on my posts asking if you're my sister." And I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest as I said, "You should read the New York Chronicle this morning. The story went live at 5 a.m. There was silence on the other end, and then the sound of typing, and I could picture her perfectly in her expensive apartment that our parents paid for, sitting in her aesthetically perfect bedroom that she'd designed for maximum Instagram appeal, Googling my name and seeing the flood of results, the major news coverage and the stock market collapse, and my face on CNN. And when she came back on the line, her voice had changed completely, all the casual superiority stripped away, leaving something that sounded almost like fear, as she said, "You broke a major fraud story. This is national news. The FBI is involved. When did you?" And I cut her off, saying, "I've been working on this investigation for 8 months, which you would know if you'd ever asked about my work, instead of mocking it publicly to millions of strangers." My parents called at 8:14, and I almost didn't answer, but some part of me needed to hear this. Needed to witness the exact moment they realized they'd been catastrophically wrong about which daughter's career mattered, and my father's voice came through bewildered saying, "Emma, we're at the gym and you're on Good Morning America. Is that really you on the television?" And I said, "Yes, that's me. I've been working on this investigation since last fall." And there was a beat of silence before my mother's voice came through in the background asking, "Why didn't you tell us you were working on something this big?" And I felt years of accumulated hurt compress into a single sharp point as I said, "You never asked about my work. You called it blogging and cute hobbies and pretend journalism. So no, I didn't tell you, because you made it very clear you didn't care." My father tried to recover, saying something about being proud and always knowing I was talented, and I hung up on him mid-sentence because I had 4 minutes to get to the NPR interview, and I wasn't going to be late to discuss the most important story of my career, so I could listen to my parents rewrite history in real time. The NPR interview ended at 9:45, and by the time I got back to my apartment, there was an email waiting from the New York Chronicle's executive editor with the subject line, "Congratulations and promotion," and when I opened it, my hands were shaking because the first line read, "Effective immediately, you are being promoted to senior investigative correspondent with an annual salary of $125,000. And I had to read it 3 times before the number became real because that was triple my previous salary. The kind of money that would let me actually save for retirement and move out of my studio apartment and stop checking my bank balance before buying groceries. My phone rang at 10:15, and it was a literary agent from one of the biggest agencies in New York, saying that 3 major publishers wanted to bid on a book about my investigation, and by 10:45, The bidding had reached $400,000 for a two-book deal, and I sat on my terrible couch that I'd bought used 5 years ago, trying to process the fact that I'd made more money in the last 6 hours than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. I did 5 major television interviews that day: CNN and MSNBC and CBS and NPR and the BBC, and in every single one I maintained complete professionalism, discussing the investigation and the evidence and the implications for corporate oversight, never once mentioning that my sister had called me a failure to 2 million people 48 hours earlier, never acknowledging that my family had dismissed this work as a cute hobby. And I felt a strange pride in that restraint because this story wasn't about them, and I refused to make it about them, even though it would have been so easy to mention the personal dimension. Meanwhile, Victoria's Instagram comments were flooding with people asking, "Isn't this your failure, sister?" And "Didn't you just post mocking her?" And someone had screenshotted her viral post about our different levels of success and placed it side by side with the headline of my investigation, and that comparison was being shared across every platform: Twitter and Reddit and TikTok. The juxtaposition so stark it almost looked like satire, her post calling me a pretend journalist with delusions next to my byline on the most important business story of the year. I watched her follower count drop in real time through a social media tracking site that Marcus showed me. 50,000 followers gone by noon, and then I saw the first brand announcement. A skincare company posting that they were re-evaluating their partnership with Victoria Richardson in light of recent events, which was corporate speak for dropping her immediately, and 2 more brands posted similar statements by 2 p.m., and I knew without asking that she was losing tens of thousands of dollars in sponsorship deals because she'd built her brand on aspirational success and relatability. And it turned out that publicly mocking your sister's career, right before she broke a massive national story, was neither aspirational nor relatable. It was just cruel and short-sighted, and the internet had a long memory for that kind of cruelty. My parents called 17 times between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m., and I declined every single call because I knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted to rewrite history in real time and claim they'd always believed in me and somehow associate themselves with my success. And I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction when 48 hours earlier, they'd been laughing while Victoria read aloud her cruel comparison of our lives. Victoria's public image was crumbling in a way that felt almost surgical in its precision, each hour bringing new damage that I could track through social media even though I wasn't posting anything myself. And at 4:15, she posted what was clearly meant to be a heartfelt apology, a carousel of images with text overlays saying, "So incredibly proud of my brilliant sister Emma. Always knew she would do amazing things. Family first always." But the comment section immediately filled with people calling her fake and calculated, and pointing out that this was quite different from calling me a pretend journalist 2 days earlier. Someone with apparent time and dedication found Victoria's original viral post about our different levels of success, the one she'd published 48 hours before my story broke, and created a side-by-side comparison with a screenshot of my New York Chronicle headline, and that image went viral faster than her original post had, spreading across Twitter and Reddit and Instagram with captions like, "She called her sister a failure on Monday. Look what the sister did on Wednesday," and "This is why you shouldn't mock people's dreams." And I watched Victoria's follower count drop in real time. 50,000 gone by noon, and another 150,000 gone by 6 p.m. And each lost follower represented not just social currency, but actual money, because her entire career was built on audience size and engagement rates. The brand cancellations came in waves throughout the afternoon, first the skincare company, and then a clothing line, and then a meal kit service, each one posting carefully worded statements about alignment with company values and ongoing evaluation of partnerships, which everyone understood meant they were dropping her immediately because associating with someone who'd publicly mocked their sister's career right before that sister broke a massive national story was terrible optics that no brand wanted. Victoria called me at 6:30, and I answered because some part of me needed to hear this, and her voice came through raw and crying, saying, Emma, you're ruining my career. I've lost $75,000 in sponsorship deals today. My engagement rates are tanking. People are attacking me in every comment section. And I felt something cold settle in my chest as I said, Victoria, I didn't post anything about you. I haven't mentioned you in a single interview. I just did my job and reported a story I'd been working on for 8 months. The story you would have known about if you'd ever asked about my work, instead of calling it a cute hobby. She tried to argue, saying something about how I could post something supportive or do an interview talking about what a great sister she was, and I hung up on her mid-sentence because I had a call scheduled with my new literary agent in 5 minutes, and I wasn't going to be late for that to manage Victoria's self-created crisis. My parents texted at 7 asking to come to my apartment, and I replied suggesting we meet tomorrow at a coffee shop near my office, neutral territory where I wouldn't feel trapped and where the public setting might keep everyone's emotions in check. And Marcus called at 7:15 saying, "Your family is going to want to take credit now. They're going to want to be part of this story, and you need to be ready to set boundaries." And I knew he was right because I could already see it happening. The way they were scrambling to associate themselves with my success after years of dismissing it. By 8 p.m. that evening, I had received over 50 interview requests from publications and programs I'd only ever dreamed of appearing on, places like Fresh Air and The Daily Show and 60 Minutes, and my new literary agent called at 8:30 to tell me that the book deal had been formalized at $400,000 for a two-book deal, the first book being an expanded investigation into the Tech Vision fraud, and the second being another investigative project of my choosing, and she explained that the advance would be paid in thirds, one-third on signing, which meant $133,000 would hit my account within 2 weeks. And I sat at my tiny kitchen table in my studio apartment trying to comprehend that number because it was more than 3 times my annual salary at my old position. A speaking agency reached out at 9:15 saying they wanted to represent me for public appearances, corporate events and journalism conferences and university lectures, and they projected I could command $25,000 per engagement, given the profile of the story and my expertise. And when I asked how many engagements they anticipated, they said conservatively I could book 12 to 15 events in the next 6 months if I wanted to, which was another $300,000 on top of everything else. And the math was becoming surreal because I'd gone from checking my bank balance before buying groceries to potentially earning close to $1 million in the next year. The career transformation was total, and it had happened in less than 24 hours. But as I sat there reviewing the offers and opportunities, I realized that this was never about proving my family wrong. It had never been about vindication or revenge. It had been about doing the work I believed mattered and doing it with integrity and thoroughness, even when nobody was watching or caring or believing it would amount to anything. And the fact that it had resulted in this level of recognition was validating, but it wasn't the point. The point had always been the truth, and the sources who'd trusted me, and the public interest in exposing corporate fraud. But I couldn't ignore the vindication completely, because it sat there in my chest like something warm and solid, the knowledge that every person who'd dismissed me and called my work a hobby and laughed at my small apartment and old car had been so completely wrong, and that the evidence of their wrongness was now playing on every news channel in the country. Victoria's fiancé called at 9:45, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me, and his voice came through tight and angry, saying that Victoria had lost 4 more sponsorship deals that afternoon, that wedding vendors were getting nervous about the negative publicity, and asking if they still wanted to move forward with their services. That her agent had called an emergency meeting to discuss reputation management, and he had the audacity to ask if I could make a public statement supporting Victoria, because this is affecting our whole future. And I said very calmly that Victoria had made a public statement mocking my career 48 hours ago, and she'd have to live with the consequences of that choice, just as I'd lived with years of public humiliation from her. And I hung up before he could respond. My parents texted at 10 p.m. saying they wanted to take me to dinner to celebrate my achievement, suggesting an expensive steakhouse downtown that they'd never offered to take me to before. And I replied saying I'd prefer to meet for coffee tomorrow afternoon at a place near my office, somewhere public and neutral where I could leave easily if I needed to. And I asked if 2 p.m. worked for them, and they responded immediately saying yes. Too eager, too transparent in their desire to be associated with this success they'd never believed would happen. I called Marcus at 10:30 because I needed to talk to someone who understood the professional implications of what was happening, and he said something I needed to hear. He said, "Your family is going to want to take credit now. They're going to rewrite history and claim they always supported you. And you need to decide right now what boundaries you're setting because they will push as far as you let them." And I knew he was right because I could already see it starting, the way my mother's text had said, "We always knew you had it in you," when 3 days ago she'd been laughing while Victoria called me a pretend journalist. I spent an hour that night thinking about what I needed to say to them, what boundaries were non-negotiable, and what I was willing to rebuild if they showed genuine change. And I realized that I wasn't interested in reconciliation that was based on my success. I was only interested in reconciliation that acknowledged the years of damage their favoritism and dismissal had caused regardless of how my career had turned out. Because my worth as a person and as their daughter shouldn't have been dependent on breaking a national story, it should have been inherent. I printed out a copy of Victoria's viral post, the one where she detailed all my failures and called my journalism career delusions, and I put it in my bag to bring to coffee tomorrow because I needed them to see it in physical form, needed them to confront the cruelty they'd enabled and encouraged. And as I set it on my table, I felt something settle in my chest, a clarity about what I deserved and what I wouldn't accept anymore. The coffee shop I'd chosen was in an upscale neighborhood near my office, the kind of place with exposed brick and expensive espresso drinks, and enough ambient noise that our conversation wouldn't be overheard, but enough openness that I wouldn't feel trapped. And I arrived at 1:55 with Marcus, who'd insisted on coming as support, even though I'd told him this was a family matter, and he'd said, "Emma, you've been dealing with your family alone for 28 years, and look where that got you. I'm coming." My parents arrived at exactly 2 p.m., and I could see them through the window before they entered. My mother in a dress that was too formal for a coffee shop, and my father in a blazer he usually reserved for important business meetings, and they looked nervous in a way I'd never seen before, uncertain of their reception, and when they spotted me at the corner table, they approached with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and my mother said, "Emma, sweetheart, we're so proud of you," before she'd even sat down. I stayed silent, watching them settle into their chairs, watching my mother's hands flutter nervously around her purse, and my father clear his throat twice without saying anything, and the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before my father tried with, "We always knew you were talented. We always believed you'd do something important." And I reached into my bag and pulled out the printed copy of Victoria's viral post, the one I'd folded carefully that morning, and I unfolded it now and placed it on the table between us where the cruel words were visible in stark black ink on white paper. "This was 2 days ago," I said, my voice steady and quiet, and I watched my mother's face pale as she recognized what she was looking at. "2 days ago, Victoria posted this, and you both liked it. And Mom, you commented, 'So honest and brave.' So what exactly changed between Tuesday and Thursday?" Victoria arrived then, 15 minutes late, wearing sunglasses inside the coffee shop, even though it wasn't particularly bright, and I could see even through the dark lenses that she'd been crying because her face was puffy and her movements were slow and defeated. And she sat down without saying anything and stared at the table. My mother tried to redirect, saying, "We were just concerned about your stability, Emma. You have to understand that journalism is such an uncertain field, and we worried about your future." But I cut her off with, "I need you to be honest. I need you to actually be honest right now, because I'm not interested in excuses or justifications. I need you to admit that you didn't believe in me, that you dismissed my work, that you favored Victoria so completely that you couldn't even see what you were doing." My father shifted in his chair and looked at Victoria and then back at me and said, We just worried about your financial security. Victoria's career seemed more stable, and I felt something cold settle in my chest because even now, even after everything, they couldn't admit the truth without qualifying it. Victoria seemed more stable isn't honesty, it's favoritism dressed up as concern, I said, and I watched my father flinch at the directness of it. And then I started listing the specific examples I'd carried silently for years, my voice gaining strength with each one. You skipped my journalism school graduation because Victoria had a brand photo shoot in Miami. You spent $15,000 on her engagement party and didn't invite me to a single planning meeting. You paid for her apartment at $3,500 a month while giving me $200 monthly for student loans. And when I won the Regional Journalism Award 2 years ago, none of you came to the dinner because Victoria needed help setting up her new ring light. And I watched my mother's face crumble with each item, but I couldn't stop because these truths had been building in my chest for so long that now that they were coming out, they felt like something physical being expelled. My mother tried to justify it with, Victoria needed more support, she was building a business. But I cut her off sharply, saying, she got $15,000 for a party. I got nothing when I won an award for the work I dedicated my life to. How is that equal support? And my father had the decency to look ashamed when he said, we didn't understand your work, Emma. Journalism seemed so uncertain, and Victoria's follower count was tangible. We could see her success. And I felt something hot and angry rise in my throat as I said, you didn't try to understand. You never once asked me about a story I was working on or read anything I'd written. You just decided that what I did didn't matter because you couldn't measure it in likes and sponsorships. Victoria had been silent through all of this, but now she broke suddenly, her voice cracking as she said, I'm losing everything, Emma. 6 more sponsors dropped me this morning. People are sending me death threats. My engagement photos got ratioed on Instagram. Everyone hates me. And I looked at her and felt something complicated move through me. Not quite sympathy, but not quite satisfaction either. And I said quietly, you publicly mocked your sister, and it turned out you were completely wrong. There are consequences for that. Victoria pulled off her sunglasses and her eyes were red and desperate as she said, can you post something supportive, just something small? It would help my image so much, people would see that you forgave me. And I felt my mouth drop open in genuine shock, because even now, even in the middle of this confrontation, she was thinking about image management and damage control rather than actual remorse. Marcus leaned forward then, his voice calm but firm as he said, maybe Victoria should apologize first, an actual apology, not a PR statement. And Victoria's face flushed as she said, I did apologize. I posted an apology yesterday. I said I was proud of Emma. But I shook my head and said, a PR apology doesn't count, Victoria. You apologized because your career was imploding, not because you actually understood what you did wrong. And there's a difference. The silence that fell then was thick and uncomfortable. My parents looking at each other with expressions I couldn't quite read, Victoria staring at her hands, and I realized that this was the first time in my entire life that I'd actually confronted them with the truth of how they'd treated me. The first time I'd refused to minimize or excuse or pretend that their favoritism hadn't carved something painful and lasting into my sense of self-worth. Victoria took a shaky breath and said something I never expected to hear from her. She said, I was jealous. And the words hung in the air of the coffee shop, while my parents stared at her with expressions of complete shock. And my mother started to say, Victoria, you don't need to. But Victoria cut her off with, no, it's true. I've been jealous of Emma our entire lives. And I felt something shift in my chest, because this was the first time Victoria had ever admitted to any vulnerability in front of our parents. The first time she'd shown anything other than her carefully curated confidence. Victoria looked directly at me then, her eyes red and raw, and said, you were always smarter than me, Emma, always more talented and more driven and more substantial. And I got attention because I was pretty and bubbly and good at performing for cameras, but you had actual substance and it terrified me. And I could see my father shift uncomfortably in his seat because this truth was exposing something about the family dynamics that everyone had tacitly agreed never to acknowledge. I built my entire career on appearance, Victoria continued, her voice cracking, on being aspirational and relatable and performing this version of success that was all surface. And you were building something real, something that mattered. And I knew that my career was shallow, but seeing you struggle made me feel better about my own choices. And this was the first genuine emotion I'd ever seen from Victoria in years, maybe ever, and I didn't know what to do with it. My mother tried to deflect, saying, "Both of you girls are talented in different ways." But I turned to my parents and asked the question I'd been holding back. Did you know you treated us differently? Did you realize what you were doing? And my mother's face became defensive as she said, "We loved you both equally, Emma. A parent's love doesn't change." And I felt anger rise hot in my throat as I said, "Love and treatment aren't the same thing. You can say you loved us equally, but your actions told a different story." I looked at my father and said, $15,000 for Victoria's engagement party versus skipping my graduation ceremony. How is that equal treatment? And I watched him struggle to find an answer that would excuse the inexcusable. And finally he said, "We were wrong, Emma. We got caught up in Victoria's visibility, in the tangible markers of her success, and we failed to see what you were building." And it was the closest thing to an admission I'd ever gotten from him. "Her follower count mattered more than my accomplishments," I said quietly, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact, and my parents couldn't deny it, because the evidence was sitting right there in front of us, in the form of years of choices and priorities and resources directed toward the child whose success they could quantify in likes and sponsorships and Instagram posts, and I watched my mother's face crumble as she realized she couldn't defend against the truth of what they'd done. I took a breath and said what I'd come here to say, laying out the terms for any future relationship between us. And my voice was steady as I told them, "No more free work for Victoria. No more demands on my time that don't respect what my time is worth. No more treating my career as less legitimate than hers just because you can't count my success in followers or likes." And I watched Victoria nod slowly, as if she understood for the first time that there were consequences to years of entitlement. "If we're going to have any kind of relationship moving forward, it has to be based on equal treatment," I continued, looking directly at my parents. "Not just right now when my success is visible and undeniable, but consistently, permanently. And that means acknowledging the pattern of favoritism, not just this one incident, but the entire history of how you chose to support Victoria while dismissing everything I tried to build." Victoria's voice was small when she asked, "Can we rebuild this, Emma? Is there any way back from what I did?" And I looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Not until you actually understand what you did, not just that the post was cruel, but that you spent years treating me like I was less than you, like my work didn't matter, like my struggles were entertainment for your audience." And I felt something break open in my chest as I finally said all of this out loud. I turned back to my parents and said, "I need you to understand the impact of what you did. The years of self-doubt I carried because my own parents didn't believe in me. The therapy I paid for out of my $42,000 salary while you were paying Victoria's rent. The award ceremonies I sat at alone while you were helping her set up ring lights. The isolation of knowing that my family thought I was failing when I was actually building something that mattered." And my mother was crying now, but I couldn't stop because they needed to hear this. "Victoria's cruelty wasn't just the post," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It was years of dismissal, years of treating me like a personal assistant, years of mocking my career to her millions of followers, and you enabled all of it by making it clear that her success was real and mine was just a hobby." And I watched my father's face as he struggled to process what I was saying. My mother reached across the table, but I pulled back and said, "I don't need your validation anymore. That's what I figured out over these past 8 months while I was working on the most important story of my career, and none of you even knew because you never asked. But I needed it then. I needed it when I was 22 and graduating, and when I was 25 and winning awards, and when I was 27 and barely making rent. And you chose Victoria every single time. My mother's voice was thick with tears as she said, "We failed you, Emma. We failed you as parents, and I don't know how to make that right." And it was the first real acknowledgement I'd ever gotten from her. The first time she'd admitted without qualification or excuse that they had damaged me through their choices. I looked at both of them and said, "I succeeded despite you, not because of you, and that's something you're going to have to live with." And my father asked quietly, "What do we do now? How do we fix this?" And I felt exhausted suddenly as I said, "That's up to you. You have to decide if you're willing to do the actual work of changing, not just saying you're proud now that the world has told you I'm worth being proud of, and I'm not going to make it easy because nothing about this has been easy for me." The days following the confrontation at the coffee shop brought a transformation so complete that sometimes I had to stop and remind myself it was real, that this was actually happening to me, and not some fantasy I'd constructed during those long nights of working on the investigation while my family slept soundly believing I was failing. Daniel Crawford's arrest came 5 days after my story broke, and I watched the perp walk on CNN from the New York Chronicle's conference room, surrounded by colleagues who kept congratulating me. And there was something surreal about seeing this man I'd spent 8 months investigating being let out in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions based on the reporting I had done, the sources I had protected, the documents I had verified line by line. My face appeared on the covers of 3 major journalism magazines that week, and Marcus framed all of them for the office wall. And every time I walked past them, I felt this strange disconnect between the professional-looking woman in those photos and the person who'd cried in her car outside her parents' house just 2 weeks earlier. The awards nominations started coming in on day 7. First the Polk Award, and then the Livingston Award, and then, impossibly, someone from the Pulitzer Board called to say my work was under serious consideration, and I had to sit down because I'd dreamed of that moment since I was 20 years old, sitting in my first journalism class. The speaking agency that reached out offered to represent me exclusively, and when they said I could command $25,000 per engagement, I actually laughed because that was more than half my annual salary at my old position, and within a week, they'd booked me for 8 events over the next 3 months, which meant $200,000 for talking about the work I'd already done. Victoria posted a video apology on day 6, and this one was different from the polished PR statement she'd made initially. This one showed her without makeup in her apartment, talking directly to the camera about jealousy and insecurity and the ways she'd hurt me, and she took down the cruel post about me and addressed the pattern of behavior, not just the one viral moment. And while part of me remained skeptical, I could see in the comments that people were responding differently this time, some with sympathy for the complexity of sibling dynamics, and some with respect for her honesty. My parents sent an email on day 4 saying they'd started family therapy and asking if I'd be willing to join eventually. And they sent a confirmation that they'd subscribed to both the New York Chronicle and 3 other journalism publications, which was such a small gesture, but it meant they were trying to understand the world I worked in. And my father started sending me articles he'd read with questions that showed he was actually trying to comprehend what investigative journalism required. The book deal advance of $200,000 hit my account on day 10, and I sat staring at my banking app, seeing more money than I'd ever had in my life, enough to move out of my studio apartment into a real one-bedroom in a better neighborhood for $4,000 a month, enough to pay off the credit cards I'd maxed during the investigation, enough to finally feel financially secure for the first time since graduating college. Marcus called me to his office on day 12 to tell me that the publication's traffic had increased by 300% since my story broke, and that major advertisers were reaching out, and that the board had approved a significant expansion of the investigative team with me as the senior editor, and I felt overwhelmed by how completely my professional life had transformed in less than 2 weeks. The Time magazine profile came out 3 weeks after my story broke, and I stood in a bookstore staring at my own face on the cover under the headline, "The Journalist Who Took Down Tech Vision," and had to resist the urge to buy every copy just to prove to myself it was real. Marcus got promoted to executive editor based partly on the publication's skyrocketing reputation after my investigation. And he told me over coffee that our small online publication had received acquisition offers from 3 major media companies, all of them citing the credibility my work had brought to our journalism. The recruitment attempts started immediately, with editors from the Washington Post and the New York Times and ProPublica all reaching out to offer positions. And while part of me was tempted by the prestige, I felt loyalty to Marcus and to the publication that had supported me when no one else believed the story was worth pursuing. The New York Chronicle came back with a counteroffer that made my decision easy, promoting me to senior investigative editor with a salary of $175,000 and a team of 4 junior reporters to lead, plus complete autonomy over which stories we pursued and how we pursued them. And I accepted because it felt like building something rather than just joining something already built. The congressional hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, with the committee requesting that I present my findings in person and walk them through how I'd uncovered the fraud scheme, and I spent hours with the legal team preparing testimony while trying not to think about the fact that I'd be speaking to actual senators about work I'd done in my tiny studio apartment while my family thought I was wasting my life. Additional whistleblowers started coming forward after seeing the impact of my initial story, people from other tech companies with evidence of similar fraud schemes, and my inbox filled with encrypted messages from sources who said they'd been waiting for someone brave enough to publish the truth. 2 journalism schools reached out asking if they could use my investigation as a case study in their investigative reporting courses, wanting to break down my methodology and source protection techniques, and I gave several guest lectures via Zoom to students who looked at me the way I'd once looked at the journalists I admired. Professor Chen from my graduate program sent a congratulatory email that was gracious and professional, though I remembered clearly the day she'd suggested I consider a career in communications instead of investigative work, because I was perhaps too sensitive for the demands of serious journalism, and I replied politely without mentioning that particular conversation. My first editor at the local paper where I'd made $28,000 a year sent a LinkedIn message saying he'd always known I'd do great things, conveniently forgetting the performance review where he'd told me I'd never break a major story because I didn't have the instincts. And I looked at his message for a long moment before deciding not to respond at all, because some vindications were better savored privately. Every doubter from my career became suddenly visible in retrospect. All the people who'd suggested I was in the wrong field, or aiming too high, or wasting my potential on stories no one cared about. And I kept a private list in my journal, not out of bitterness, but out of a desire to remember how lonely it had felt when their doubts were the loudest voices in my head. Through all the attention and offers and acclaim, I tried to handle the fame with grace, consistently crediting my sources in every interview and emphasizing that investigative journalism was collaborative work that required trust and courage from whistleblowers who risked everything to tell the truth. And I made sure Marcus and the legal team got recognition because I knew I couldn't have done any of it alone. 3 months had passed since the story broke, and Victoria called on a Tuesday afternoon to ask if I'd come to her wedding, her voice tentative in a way I'd never heard before, and she said quickly that she'd hired a professional photographer for $8,000 and wasn't asking me to work just to attend as a guest if I wanted to. And I stood in my new apartment, looking out at a view I still wasn't used to, and considered the question seriously, because the progress over these months had been real, even if it was slow and sometimes painful. My parents had been attending therapy every week, both individual sessions and couples counseling to understand their patterns of favoritism, and my father had started calling me every Sunday to ask about my work, actually listening when I explained the investigations I was pursuing, asking informed questions that showed he'd been reading the articles I sent him. My mother had written me a handwritten letter that arrived 6 weeks after our confrontation, 4 pages of careful script acknowledging specifically the ways she'd failed me, not making excuses but taking responsibility. And I'd cried reading it because it was the first time she'd truly seen me clearly, without comparing me to Victoria or dismissing my path as less valuable than my sister's visibility. Victoria's career had shifted dramatically after her honest apology video, her follower count dropping from 2 million to 800,000. But the remaining audience was different, more engaged and authentic, and she'd pivoted to content about sibling relationships and family dynamics, and the pressure of social media perfectionism. And while it was less lucrative, she told me in one of our tentative phone calls that she felt happier creating it. She'd asked me to coffee 2 weeks before the wedding call, and I'd agreed to meet at the same coffee shop where we'd had the confrontation, and we sat across from each other and talked honestly for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever. And she said, "I'm sorry I needed to lose everything to see you." And I found myself responding, "I'm sorry it took public humiliation for me to set boundaries." And we were both crying, but it felt clean somehow, like lancing a wound that had been infected for years. Victoria told me that watching my success had forced her to confront the emptiness of building a career on appearance and comparison, that she'd spent years feeling inadequate, despite the followers and money. Because she knew deep down she hadn't built anything real, and seeing me create something meaningful through years of unglamorous work had made her jealous in ways she couldn't admit until everything crashed. I shared things I'd never told her about the years of therapy I'd paid for trying to understand why I felt invisible in my own family, about the nights I'd questioned my career choice, because the people who were supposed to believe in me didn't, about the specific pain of watching them celebrate her while dismissing my achievements as hobbies. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and we didn't fix everything because that wasn't possible. But we started something new, a relationship based on honesty, rather than the toxic dynamic we'd fallen into, where she performed superiority, and I absorbed it until I couldn't anymore. When she asked me to attend her wedding, I thought about the past 3 months of genuine effort from all of them, the ways my parents had shown up differently, the vulnerability Victoria had demonstrated, and I said yes, because I wanted to believe that people could change, even if they had to lose everything first to find the motivation. The Pulitzer ceremony took place on a warm May evening, 6 months after my story broke, in a grand ballroom at Columbia University filled with journalists I'd admired my entire career, and when they announced my name as the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting, I stood from my seat with hands shaking and walked to the stage thinking about the studio apartment where I'd worked on this investigation, convinced no one would care. And I looked out at the audience and saw my parents in the third row crying with pride, genuine emotion on their faces that I'd spent 28 years wanting to see. Victoria had posted a message that morning, a thoughtful tribute that talked about watching her sister pursue truth even when no one believed in the story, and it had gotten modest engagement from her smaller following, but I knew it was genuine because she'd called me the night before just to say she was proud, no agenda attached, and that private moment had meant more than any public post ever could. My acceptance speech focused on thanking the sources who had risked their careers to tell the truth, the legal team who had protected both them and me, Marcus and the publication that had supported the investigation even when it seemed impossible, and the fundamental importance of journalism that served the public interest rather than corporate power. And I didn't mention my family drama publicly because that had never been what the work was about, even if the personal vindication had been undeniably sweet. The private moment came afterward, at a quiet family dinner my parents had arranged at a restaurant near my apartment. Just the four of us in a corner booth, and my father said, "We're sorry we couldn't see this coming." And I found myself responding, "I couldn't see it either until it happened." Because the truth was, I'd believed in the story, but I hadn't let myself imagine success on this scale, hadn't dared to hope that the work might lead here. Victoria held my hand across the table and said, "You deserved better from all of us." And she meant it. I could see it in her face. And I squeezed her hand back because forgiveness was still a work in progress, but we were building something new from the ruins of what we'd had before. I reflected sitting there that the success wasn't vindication of my worth as a person, because that had always existed whether they recognized it or not, but rather validation that the work itself mattered, that investigative journalism served a purpose, that speaking truth to power created change, and those were truths that existed independent of awards or recognition. The family relationships were improving slowly and realistically. Therapy and honest conversations replacing the toxic patterns of comparison and dismissal. But there was no fairy tale ending, because real life didn't work that way, and some damage took years to heal completely. My career was flourishing with another major investigation already underway, this one into pharmaceutical pricing schemes, and I was leading my team through the painstaking work of document review and source cultivation that I now knew was the unglamorous foundation of stories that mattered. The final thought I had that night, walking home alone through Manhattan streets, was that my worth had never been dependent on their recognition, that I'd found it myself through the hardest years of doubt and grinding work. But it was real now, earned through sources protected and truth exposed and power held accountable, and it was unshakable because I'd built it myself when no one was watching, and I carried that knowledge with me like armor against any future doubt, thinking clearly for the first time in my life that I didn't need them to believe in me anymore because I believed in myself, and that belief was enough, more than enough. It was everything.